Welcome aboard the Pilot Money Guys podcast, where our mission is to help professional pilots build and protect wealth on their journey to financial freedom. This podcast is brought to you by Leading Edge Financial Planning.
All right. Hello, Nolan, and welcome to Flight 126 with the Pilot Money Guys. Today, Nolan, the meat of the mission is going to be how to retire early from the airlines or fractional professional pilot, whatever it might be. How to retire early. We've been getting a lot of interest in that lately for whatever reason, Nolan.
Who wouldn't be interested, right? Retire early, count everyone in, right? So I think right. This is a fun one to talk about.
It is. It's going to be fun. We'll talk about some strategies, some techniques, maybe a hybrid retirement. We'll throw that in there too. And you're going to help us with the emotional side of this thing, which is don't turn this off because I said that, because that is a huge component, probably the biggest component of retiring early. But again, welcome Pilot Money Guys, Flight 126. We're glad all of you are joining us, our pilot tribe, and where our mission is to deliver actionable ideas, simplify the complex, cut through financial noise, Nolan, and help you build a future mindset or build a mindset for financial success and life success. And so we're excited about that. Today, we've got questions from the flight deck. We're going to talk about one quick tax update that I think is a commonly maybe misunderstood thing about IRAs. We're going to talk about the war in Iran that's going on and just how we think about that. We put out a couple, articles or emails on that so far, but we'll talk to it a little bit today and see if we can kind of bring some perspective to that. You've got some good thought nuggets there for us as well. And then we'll jump into the meat of today's mission. But Nolan, anything exciting in your world going on? Anything you want to share with the audience? Let's go on. Any secrets you want to share? Any words of wisdom?
No secrets. No secrets. And words of wisdom. Hopefully, we'll have some of those throughout the podcast here. But I'm just glad that it's finally looking like we may have spring on the horizon. I know you said you got some golf in yesterday, which is always good. But I'm hoping it's here.
Yep, me and Kevin, I got Kevin out of the tax time of season and said, let's go play some golf. And we went and tortured ourselves on the golf course, took a beating in the rain. And so anyway, it was good. It was fun and humbled us a little bit as well, right? As if we needed that.
That's right.
And we had all of our new equipment. Kevin got him some new irons. I got me a new little putter for Christmas. And it may have saved a stroke the whole time. So it's totally worth it, right?
And they got rained on. So
totally worth it. All right. I love it. So, all right, let's jump in, Nolan. First of all, a couple, the big question from the flight deck today is just, the Iran war, what's going on there. But before we do that, we're in the middle of tax season. One of the biggest thoughts is trying to get, maximize people's IRAs before the April 15th deadline. And so that's just it. A lot of times, Nolan, people don't know that they can contribute to an after-tax or non-deductible IRA regardless of income by April 15th. If you've already filed your tax return, it's really not too late. You can go on and file a Form 8606 if you want to document that contribution. But to me, Nolan, I don't know about you, that's one of those that's often misunderstood. We hear a lot of people say, I make too much money to contribute to an IRA. And that's only true in two cases. One of those is if you want to deduct the contribution, and the other is you probably make too much money to contribute directly to a Roth IRA. So those are things I think that are important because it's still a good opportunity to do that if you're looking for the next place to save. But what do you think, Nolan? Any comments on that?
I think it's a great point. So just to kind of recap and get a little more specific on it. So if we're talking for 2025 and we're in 2026 right now, let's say if someone's below the age of 50, they haven't contributed for 2025 yet, they can contribute $7,000, which was the IRS limit for 2025. If you're below 50, over 50, it'd be $8,000. You can still do it, you're saying, until April 15th.
2026. You nailed it.
2026. Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying that. Yeah. And no, the hope is that, again, this is a whole nother podcast. You and I did a couple. You and I did one. Me and Andy did another about Roth and backdoor Roth and all those rules. But, if you are able to put money in an after-tax IRA, maybe there's a strategy, again, refer to those previous two podcasts where you can convert in a future time. But it takes a lot of tax planning there, and this is not tax advice. So make sure you do your homework before that with your tax professional. but still a good opportunity there that people
Absolutely.
think they cannot do. So wanted to get that out there as one of the nuggets. But Nolan, we're pressing in. It's been an interesting time so far lately. Last week or so, I think the Iran war has been going on now for probably a little over a week. We're starting to see some of the impacts of that with gas prices. Stock market's been, a little shaky. And so any initial thoughts from you, Nolan, on just big picture?
Yeah, I'm kind of, you alluded to it, starting to see it in our day-to-day life, right?
Yeah.
Like Claire and I went to the gas station the other day. Is it Sam's? You can get, if you're a Sam's Club member, you can get a little bit more affordable gas, and the line was forever long.
Oh, wow.
This is just like a few days after we're in. I think so. The timestamp this, I guess, today is March 9th. We're about 10 days in, I think, to this war. So that's where we're at now. So of course, whatever we're talking about now, it could change the next time someone's listening to this. But yeah, the gas line was just forever long, and I've seen that a few times when we've driven past. Now, people may have been trying to get gas before they thought it would spike up, which it already kind of has. But I think it takes on a new. You mentioned emotion earlier. We'll talk about that with retirement, but it's the same thing in investing too, right? I mean, it can be a very emotional thing, especially when you start to see it impact your day-to-day life. But yeah, I just wanted to echo that it does get more
absolutely.
real.
It does get, and it's one of my quotes when I was in the military, I remember is Civil War general, I think is William Tecumseh Sherman. I think I pronounced that correctly. War is hell, and there's no doubt about that. And so I know that we're going to see some impacts on our end, but it's hell regardless. And for us, we just think about at this very moment, and again, sometimes it feels callous to think about like our own finances when these terrible things are happening. And I'm not saying the purpose, we're not going there politically and all that stuff, but it's just difficult, right? And so it feels a little callous sometimes to think like, oh, how's this going to affect my investments? But it's okay to think that it's responsible to kind of go, I need to take inventory personally, because at this very moment in time, Nolan, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. By the time this podcast comes out, we don't know. This thing could be over. It could have a good ending. We don't know that, or it could drag on. At these moments in time, you just have to accept all the uncertainty and plan for that. And that's really hard to do. It's always easy looking back like, oh yeah, this is what happened in hindsight, we know, but at this moment, we have no idea.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I was going to share a few things of, in terms of going back to the basics, sometimes can help me out in terms of what's happened in the past when there's been wars. And of course, that doesn't mean they're all different, right? They all look different. It doesn't mean it's going to end the same. And so of course, our listeners have heard this over and over again that, we do look at what does the academic evidence show us about investing. Sometimes it does bring a little comfort to me to look at those times and to say, remind myself like, hey, this is why we're staying the course. And that is, to your point, Charlie, the market do not behave the way we would think, right? Because I think it was over the weekend, 2 weeks ago, I guess, whenever this all started with the U.S. and Iran, and the market opened on Monday, and I think it closed, and it was a positive day, right? And I wasn't expecting that. Maybe someone else was, but who knows, right? You just don't know. So I was going to share a few nuggets here from Ben Carlson. He's a blogger in this space. He's a chartered financial analyst, very sharp guy in the finance world. I know we've shared his stuff multiple times here on the podcast, but he wrote an article titled "The Stock Market is Heartless." And really, it's to what you just said, Charlie. It's like war is hell, right? Like it's not anything any of us enjoy hearing about or listening to the news about it. But the stock market doesn't care, right? It's not a human, it doesn't have emotion. It's going to react in ways that we would not suspect. And he talked about the 2 world wars in U.S. history and was saying how, during 2 of the worst wars in modern history, the stock market was up a combined 115% during that time. And so I wouldn't have guessed that before. If someone were to ask me those numbers before I actually knew, I would not have guessed that. He used the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. He said how that 2-week period during that time lasted about 13 days, that the Dow was just pretty calm during that time. It only lost or went down 1.2%. So he didn't say that to say that every time there's a war, the market does surprisingly well. I think he was just pointing that out to say that who knows, right? Who would have guessed?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got to maintain our humility during these times and realize it's unknowable, and be careful about jumping to assumptions like, hey, this is happening and therefore the market will decline. Some people jump to that conclusion. We just don't know. And, another one, Nolan, and that Cuban Missile Crisis, can you imagine what it must have been like? Because we literally thought it was going to be the end. It could have been a nuclear disaster, so there's been some pretty scary times in our past as well. And the 60s was one of those decades that was pretty scary. But, one of the things we think about is what do we do during times like this? And the way we think about it too is we have to prepare for times like this. The moment that we invest our money, my personal, your personal, Nolan, and even our clients, is we have to assume that something is going to surprise us that we cannot anticipate or we don't know is coming. And we have to make sure that people are prepared. And, Nolan, you and I do that and our team does that. So we can sleep well at night, knowing that our clients are taken care of should something terrible happen that we can't foresee. And so those things are already done. Sometimes people will say, well, what are you going to do right now? We go, well, we've already done it. If we knew exactly the timing of these events and exactly what was going to happen, then yeah, we could wait and time it perfectly. But that's obviously not possible in our opinion anyway. So
absolutely. Yeah. I always, tell our clients that if we're making wholesale changes in these types of times, or really right now, it's not even, it could go down a lot more, Charlie, right? So it's like I say in times like these, but really we're anticipating that something could happen. Something could always happen, but really, I mean, it could be a lot worse than it is right now in terms of the market. But I always say if we are changing or making wholesale changes when the market is not doing well, we're not doing our job, right? Because that was meaning we weren't anticipating bad things to happen. And academic evidence does not support that, of course. We all know that bad things are always going to happen. We just don't know what they're going to look like.
Yeah. This time last year when the tariffs were happening,
yeah.
Ben Carlson, you quoted him earlier, and I think he put out a good piece, and he said something to the effect, and I captured it because I think it's just really good. He said, if I knew what was going to happen, there would be no reason to diversify. And, I think you could even take that one step further and go, not only do we need to know what's going to happen, we need to know exactly when it's going to happen. There were people, and you can look at the watch the movie or read the book, The Big Short. Those guys, I think they're still in the news, hedge fund, there's a few people, they kind of knew what was going to happen. They said, oh, this housing market's not sustainable. But this was in the early 2000s, Nolan. And they're like, this is not sustainable. This is going to go bad. We're going to short this market. And it wasn't until 7 or 8 years later that it came true, and they almost ran out of money. So it was quite a story, but that's kind of a fascinating example. But, back to the steps, what do we do? What have we done? Automate good decisions ahead of time. Follow the investment plan, even when it's uncomfortable, like right now could be, or maybe it becomes uncomfortable. Diversify the portfolio to account for different market environments. Don't obsess over these short-term movements, and don't let the short-term volatility dictate how you live your life. And every investor needs their own survival plan. The most important thing is to have a plan in the first place. So those are some really good nuggets to hopefully, if things get more difficult, then maybe those are some things to hang your hat on to help out a little bit.
Yep, absolutely. All easier said than done, but I think they're good reminders, and we remind ourselves of that during times like these and looking at the academic evidence, because it can, again, definitely easier said than done sometimes.
Yep, absolutely. And Nolan, we've got like lots of steps to do in times like these. Maybe we'll cover that on our next podcast. Yeah. All the things to think about, like tax loss harvesting, Roth conversions, other strategies when the market's down. Absolutely. But what else, Nolan? Anything on that? I love the article you quoted there, because sometimes we think when bad things happen in the world, the market's going to go down, and that's just not always the case.
Yeah, I had one more thing. Storing questions from the flight deck. I always like to think about what questions have we had from clients lately, and sometimes, as you mentioned, being an investor, it really does take a lot of humility, because we're having to say we don't know what's going to happen next. Now I'm sharing, can you see the screen, Charlie? Yeah. So sharing this beautiful graphic here, right? Now we always say this one makes us want to throw up sometimes when you first look at it. It's like, oh, what's going on here with this one? But I do like it because sometimes when there's certain news headlines going on, people can start to predict. I think that this specific sector is going to do well based on this certain headline, right? And so all this chart is showing is that, hey, you cannot look at this and find a pattern of what the next best sector is, how it's going to perform. And a great example of that, I mean, there's all kinds on this chart. So if you look at energy, this is in 2014 when this starts all the way to 2023. But it's best to worst returns. Energy, 2014, 2015, 4 years in a row, it's the worst. And then bam, 2021, 2022, it's the top performing sector. Healthcare, look at this one, 2015, it was the best one. And then, next year, it's the worst. So again, you could pick all kinds of examples on this chart of that, but I do like it to just show that we cannot predict this stuff, so that we want to own the whole market, of course, and be diversified, but just kind of another way to put what we've been saying.
Yeah, I love that. And for those of you, Nolan shared a screen where you can go on YouTube and see that, of course, but it basically shows the ranking and performance of the previous years. And to me, Nolan, too, that also speaks to don't glob onto yesterday's winners and just invest in them. And that's typically what we do. That's what we, behaviorally do. It's the recency bias where we buy the yesterday's winners, and they're not always tomorrow's winners. In fact, most of the time they're not. And it could be the opposite. So it's hard to maintain the discipline and not invest, as we say, looking through the rearview mirror, because that's what happens a lot of times. We look at those big winners the last few years. We want to get those. We don't want to miss out. And next thing you know, they're the tomorrow's losers. So it's really a game of discipline, in our opinion, anyway. So,
absolutely.
All right. Good words. All right, Nolan. So let's jump into the meat of the mission. Some of the things we just talked about are going to apply to those of you that are thinking about retiring early. So we're going to talk about the art and the science of early retirement. Some of these little steps that we provide here or talk to may be kind of like no-duh steps, like you better know your budget before you step out of the cockpit, and for permanently anyway, because you need to know how much you're going to spend. You need to know how much, your portfolio is going to allow you to spend, and maybe other things such as pensions and whatnot. But we'll talk to that. So how to retire early from the airlines. We're going to hit 5 nuggets, Nolan, that are what we might call the science of finance, just practical steps. Science might be overstating it a bit, but maybe habits or techniques, strategies that one should think about if they want to retire early. And then we're going to hit about 5 nuggets of things to prepare for emotionally, mentally. What are you going to do? You know what I mean? And that's a huge transition, Nolan. Like one day you're flying, one day you're carrying around passengers, one day you're a very important person, and next day you may not be, except in the eyes of your spouse, hopefully. Anyway, so those are big adjustments. And what we're seeing lately are some of our 50-year-olds, maybe early mid 50-year-olds go, hey, you know what? We used to have to retire at 60. I think I'm going to do that, and I love that idea. And I love that plan. And you know what, Nolan, let's say we plan and we prepare, and then 60 comes along and we go, no, you know what? I'm not going to retire early. At least you have the option to do so. And I think, Nolan, I can tell you from experience, when you go to a job where there's less pressure on, let's say, paying bills or paying down debt or trying to make the most, for most, they always say, don't leave any money on the table. When you kind of let go of some of those stressors, the job can be a little bit more enjoyable. And so, that's the thing where we've seen people get to this point where they're like, hey, you could retire. And they go, you know what? That's a really good feeling, but I'm going to keep flying a little bit because now I enjoy it more, knowing, that there's not that pressure of, having to do it, quite frankly, Nolan. But that's a different mindset that we love to see happen with some of our clients.
For sure. I love it. I kind of hear my dad always used to say, prepare for the worst and the best will happen. In that case, you're preparing for, at worst, you got to retire at 60. But really, of course, we know it's not the case. But if you plan that way, then that just makes everything else, if you do work, icing on the cake in some ways, and you don't have to. Absolutely.
I know some of our clients, I remember it was back in 2013, 2014, and they were preparing and working, paying down debt, saving as much as they could. And then a new airline contract came along, 2016. They're like, you know what? This puts us over that hump. This puts us, this new contract, new pay rates, new savings, whatever, puts us in a position now because we've been preparing and working so much. Hey, we could retire, so it's really phenomenal to see that one, trigger or one event go, all right, here we are. And that's a great feeling. So Nolan, let's jump into the five. We're going to cover the strategy, the steps, the habits, whatever you want to call them first. And the first one's going to be, again, the no duh factor, but Nolan, you have to know how much you're going to spend in retirement. And I know, again, people are like, no duh, but it's really hard. And I'll say for me personally, Nolan, I don't really do a great job of budgeting. I mean, I know I could track my spending. I'm trying to be responsible adulting, Nolan, right? But I think I'm similar to a lot of our clients where they're like, you know what? We save enough, we save here, we save there, and then the rest we are able to spend. And that's great. We're not saying that, hey, you need to lock down a highly disciplined budget to the pennies until you think you want to retire. And then you really need to know, right? You need to know so that you know that your investments, that your pensions, Social Security mixed in there are going to provide those needs. But Nolan, what do you think?
Absolutely. I love what you said about the budgeting, right? I mean, we're not hardcore budgeters in the sense that everyone has to have a to the penny budget. I think automated savings has changed a lot of that, right? Like I believe in paying yourself first in the sense that if you save what you need to, then, at the end of the day, after you've done all those things, the rest of your money, like you said, is just kind of, yours to do with what you please and make sure everything's paid. But retirement is different, as you mentioned, because it's, the savings has already been done. And so you really have to know what are you going to need on a month to month basis, right? And what's it going to feel like not getting, because most likely your paycheck will be a little smaller, right? For a lot of our Southwest or just any pilots out there, your paycheck will most likely be smaller in retirement because different expenses will fall off, right? Maybe the kids aren't at home anymore. You won't have that as an expense. The home may be paid off, but you'll still have property tax and insurance. So it's just a different calculus in determining that. But Charlie, what have you seen, you think, from our pilots with, a good way to hammer down on that? Because I think it's very hard for people, even when they're going through the planning process with us, to think, what's life going to be like when I retire, right? Because they may have, again, kids in the house. That really it's hard to imagine life without that and without having the expenses of that. And so one day it'll be a reality and then it'll just be, be in retirement. And then what's it look like then?
Oh, no. Yeah, it's crazy, but we do model it with our clients. We sit down and some of our folks go, well, we have no idea. And that's okay. We start that discussion, we start the modeling of it, the planning, and then they kind of grow into getting more familiar with what's being spent. Now, some of our folks will show up and they'll know exactly, and either way is fine with us. But the point is when you seriously start to think about this early retirement, you got to get a handle on that. You got to start first tracking the spending, and then you got to start determining what will be different when we retire versus right now, because it's let's just call it messy. When you have kids either in high school, sports especially, are crazy expensive, or college, all those things will be different. All of a sudden, poof, they're gone, and you get a big pay raise. And so it's really hard to discern sometimes how it will be different. But you just got to do the homework, and so we've seen some of our folks, Nolan, where they've tested it. Before they retire, they're like, hey, we're going to spend this next 3 months living off of our retirement budget. And now, granted, there will be things that don't happen during that 3 months, like a new roof, new heating and air, which could be 10, 15 grand. So those expenses will continue to pop up. But again, we can plan for those too. Your house doesn't know that you're retired, Nolan. It's still going to need a new roof.
That's right.
You're going to need a new car probably at some point. But those are things to think about and practice it. Practice that budget before you determine it's time to go. So
absolutely.
So that's a big one and a tough one. And not easy. It's not like scientific, super complicated, but it does take some discipline and some practice to determine that. So
yeah.
The numbers 2, Nolan, this is the big one. How will you get distributions from your portfolio? Now, Today we're going to be raising a lot of questions for you to think about. We don't have the time. Each one of these topics, Nolan, could be its own podcast, and we have other podcasts that address them. So how will you get distributions? In other words, it's a really weird transition to save your whole life into this 401k. And then a week later, you flip this switch and you start taking that money out. First of all, it's difficult emotionally. And secondly, you better understand the math on how that happens and the risks that can come out of there. Again, we got to be careful on this step number 2, Nolan, because you and I could talk for a long time on it, but it's not easy. You have to put some thought into it. There's other strategies like the 4% rule. There's some downsides to that. There's the RMD strategy, pros and cons. There's the guardrail strategy. There's the dynamic spending strategy that Vanguard talks about. You might have annuities, pensions. So to me, Nolan, this is one of the biggest problems to solve as far as how will you spend your retirement money in a tax efficient manner as well. But what do you think?
Yeah, well, you nailed it. That we could talk about this for a whole podcast. Yeah. And one other thing I thought about was, well, if you're retiring early, then you better be careful too on when you pull that money out and having certain buckets saved, right? Because if you pull out of your 401k in certain circumstances before 59 and a half, then you could get a penalty for that. Now there's the rule of 55 and a lot of other things, but that's just so many things to consider, I guess, is our point when you're retiring early. And my point being there, and I think you're going to get to it, is that having multiple different or assets that are taxed differently in different accounts. So that way you have flexibility when you retire early, because that's a huge thing, because it may prevent you from retiring early if you don't have that.
Yeah, you're right about that. And if you start thinking about early retirement early enough, then it's really going to help. I'm going to share this really quickly because oftentimes we think about, this is from Fidelity. I took this a while back just to kind of share every once in a while. Fidelity put this slide out probably several years ago, but the traditional way of thinking about tax efficient retirement income is conventional wisdom, as we say, is taxable account withdrawal first. That might be a brokerage or maybe some money in the bank and a CD or whatever. And then you might dip into tax deferred, which would be 401ks, IRAs, pre-tax potentially. And then you might lastly dip into tax exempt, maybe a Roth 401k, Roth IRA. That is kind of conventional wisdom. In fact, Nolan, some of our software is designed that way as well to mimic that. But we also know that there are some other techniques. This is just a quick intro. Fidelity, put this out. It's kind of interesting to see that if you maybe put some more thought into it, mix and match your assets, consider these on the right side of the screen. In fact, for our YouTube audience here, these might think of these as buckets of different sources of investments that are taxed differently. If you mix and match those buckets, taxable, tax deferred, tax exempt, in this slide, Fidelity is saying you could lower your tax bill by a 38% reduction. They went from $45,600 tax bill to $28,000 approximately as far as the tax bill is concerned, just based on how you pulled the money out, not to mention potential Roth conversions and things like that. But anything on that, Nolan, you're thinking about?
No, I mean, it's, as you mentioned, it's nice to have options, right? I mean, I think that's the upshot. You won't be disappointed if you get to retirement and have multiple buckets of assets that you can pull from, especially when maybe big expenses come up that you weren't expecting. Instead of pushing you into a higher tax bracket, maybe you have some Roth, brokerage monies, whatever it may be.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just time to prepare. The earlier you start preparing for that, the better, just to have those options. So that's kind of what we wanted to communicate there. But all right. So that's the big one. The bucket strategy, Nolan, we could talk about that. We've done podcasts on that before. That could be very helpful. Sometimes people go, hey, how do I do this? We have people that are do-it-yourselfers. How do I do this myself? To me, this was one of those that would require the most work, the most preparation, and maybe the most complex. But there are ways to do it yourself. In fact, some of our folks have told us about some softwares. We've seen one called Bolden.com. Boldin, Bolden.com, seems to have a pretty good reputation online as far as helping people if they're do-it-yourselfers. And so we encourage people to check that out, Nolan. But all right, that's number two. Number three, I got to hustle to get you through to yours, man, because yours are even more interesting. Number three, I might kind of get through number three quickly because, again, it's one of those we know. That is the risk in your portfolio. Obviously, if you're 50 and you're looking at a 65-year-old retirement, that's 15 years. If you shrink that time horizon, then you really want to be careful about the risk as you get closer to that retirement point. Obviously, it needs to be reduced. Nolan, I'll say one thing, and then I'll hand it off to you for any comments. But sometimes we often think as humans like, hey, I'm going to take high risk so I can get high reward. And that's true if you're 25, 30, 35, et cetera. But if you look at our software, Nolan, and you're 55 and you're retiring at 60, this is fascinating because if you take the portfolio in that software and you increase the risk, which, yeah, should over the long term increase the return, it actually could reduce that probability of success because it's so close to retirement. It's counterintuitive sometimes because we think high risk, high reward, but not if you're within a few years of retirement. It could actually reduce your probability of success because of that risk having to take into consideration there.
Yeah, you always got to think of what your need for risk is, right? Like you mentioned, someone that's younger, the need for risk is substantial because of inflation over time and needing to invest to get higher returns. But if you're close to retirement, you've done a lot of the heavy lifting up to that point. So it's almost a greater risk, as you mentioned sometimes, to try to be more aggressive.
Yeah, absolutely. And watch out for what's called sequence of return risk. People that sell annuities. By the way, annuities aren't evil, all of them, but a lot of people sell annuities, make large commissions, so watch out for that. But they will use what's called sequence of return risk. In other words, the most challenging point of your retirement is that first year. So we simulate 2008. And back in 2008, Nolan, I was still flying and people were retiring at age 60 in 2008. So it was really challenging. And so simulate that, be ready for it. And that can help you prepare. All right. Number four, how will you cover healthcare? Again, this is an entire podcast on its own. I think we've done one, and we've done one with, we interviewed Cole Craven with Move Health. So check out that podcast. It's very educational, informative. Nolan, each airline has different, retiree health programs if you retire before 65, or if you retire at 65 with a younger spouse. Those of you at Delta, you can go to ALPA and they'll have some programs for you to potentially purchase healthcare. If you don't have TRICARE, Southwest has its own programs, as does United and American and several others. And they can all depend. Nolan, what we've seen is if you're able to purchase healthcare from your airline, and let's say you're retiring at 60, we've seen those healthcare rates anywhere from $1,000 up to $2,000, depending on if you have, married couple, you still have dependents, what kind of plan you get. So you could get it for $1,000 to $2,000. We've seen that if you retire early and you purchase it through your airline or union. But each airline is a little bit different on those programs. But Nolan, any thoughts so far on that?
No, I guess the only thing I would add is that, not surprisingly, probably that healthcare will most likely be the number one expense for our retirees. So that, again, the reason we have it is in our top 5 there because it is a huge expense. So maybe one thing I thought of is that a health savings plan, if it's the right circumstance for someone, of course, if you're relatively healthy, you will have a higher deductible, and that is a pretty great place to save money for healthcare. And if you're able to let that grow, it's the only triple tax advantaged account, of course. So you'll put the money in there, you won't pay tax on that. It'll reduce your taxable income. It'll grow tax free, and you can take it out tax free for medical expenses. So that would be pretty great to show up to retirement with some funds in there.
You nailed it. You reminded me of the United folks where they have the ability to do the HRA and then convert that to the RHA. I mean, that's a phenomenal program. I think kind of unique to United as well, in that we don't see that at the other airlines very often. Although we do see every one of them has the HSA as well, like you mentioned, which is great. So those things can be really helpful. Plan early for those, just in case of an early retirement. The last thing I'll say on that is there is a possibility that depending on where, like we talked about the tax efficiency of your income, if you're pulling income from your investments, Nolan, let's just pretend you saved up a lot of cash or cash in a non-IRA, non-401k, what we call a brokerage account, and let's say those are capital gains, there's a lot of things that have to line up here, Nolan. So I'm kind of treading carefully, but there is a chance that if your income in retirement, your modified adjusted gross income is low enough, then you might be able to get tax credits from the healthcare.gov. So we've seen that happen before. If you're pulling 100% out of your money out of your pre-tax 401k and early retirement, it's not going to happen. Not going to happen. You have to have the diversification of income to keep your adjusted gross income low enough to qualify for those ACA tax credits.
Exactly. It goes right back to that chart you showed from Fidelity. It's, you can kind of mix and match with those buckets of income, and it takes serious planning for that, right? Because you have to really determine what's my income going to be this year. Okay, I'll take a little bit from here, a little bit from there. And so that's kind of that art and science behind it for sure.
Yeah, it is. And it gets a little complicated as far as this healthcare.gov, but it's a percentage of your income that you qualify for credits. And I went on AI, Nolan, and got a whole scenario about it, but just keep in mind and go check that out. You may have some more questions. If you are retiring early, you don't have airline healthcare, early retirement, or military TRICARE, that could be an option depending on how much adjusted gross income you have. All right. Last one before I hand it off to you. Consider a hybrid early retirement. Nolan, this is one of my favorites because any of you, Delta, Southwest, United, American, FedEx, UPS, you name it, you could, if you have the right seniority, there's a big if, fly a couple 3-day trips a month. Again, I know that's different at FedEx and UPS. Your trips are like a week or two long. But anyway, so fly a couple a month. This is where it sounds rebellious and people are going to scoff. If you want an early retirement, stop saving in the 401k, reduce your schedule to a couple trips a month. Your airline or your carrier is going to put into the 401k, the NEC. We've seen, Nolan, where some of our part-timers can make $250 to $270 as a captain part-time, a couple trips a month, and they get their 401k nearly maxed out just by the airline. They don't take anything. This is the key. They don't have to take any distributions from their investments. They get to delay that a couple of years because they've reduced their savings. They're flying less, and they're on somewhat of a hybrid retirement. So we've run numbers for that before, and knowing that could be a successful strategy if somebody's thinking, I'm not quite ready to cut the cord completely, but I'm ready to ease into this thing. That could be a great strategy.
Yeah, it's like not only is it helpful financially, right? Because you're working a little longer, you may not be saving anything more, but the airline's shoveling all that money in there. But it's also probably good emotionally too, right? You're not just going all in, right? Yeah. Especially for people who haven't maybe thought a lot about retirement. It's a good way to just kind of practice it out, as you mentioned, and not just go all in. And then at that point, there's really not much going back.
No return. Yeah.
No
return. Yeah, absolutely. And I can again attest to the fact that when you fly a little less, and yes, leave some money on the table. That's what retirement is. We leave some money on the table. Yeah. Then you kind of enjoy the job a little bit more. It gets exhausting out there, week after week, and just kind of wears you down a little bit. And we've seen people do that successfully. So check that out. If you have more interest on that, just let us know. We'll kind of share with you some details and some simulations that we've done, depending on your airline and programs. But Nolan, those are the 5 steps that I thought were very important. If you want to consider early retirement, you got to know your spending. You got to start really getting down in the nitty gritty, practice it. You've got to know how you're going to get distributions from your portfolio, taxable, tax-free, pre-tax, whatever it might be. That's going to determine your taxable income, tax efficiency, if you will. Lots of different strategies there. Number 3, what's the investment game plan? Watch out for sequence of return risk. Healthcare is a big one. Can be very expensive and could be the make or break if you're spending upwards of $2,000 a month. That could be a significant barrier. And lastly, Nolan, consider that hybrid part-time retirement. Feels weird not to put any money in your own 401k, but it can be a benefit because you're not pulling from the portfolio at the same time. So it could be a little bit of a good, in between full-time retirement and full-time working.
Absolutely. So what I hear is there's a lot to plan for.
That's right, man. A lot of thought,
Right.
but it can be done. We've seen people do it,
Absolutely.
and nobody that I've seen to do that has regretted it. So anyway, so take that for what it's worth there. But Nolan, let's transition to the art of retirement. This is the tough part. I think this is the toughest. We talked about some strategic steps and planning and habits, but man, mentally leaving this thing you've done for so long is really hard. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to what you said, right? It's doing. I think as humans, we don't love change naturally. Probably now we can all kind of maybe retrain ourselves to be more open to change, but it's still hard, I think, for most people, and we see that a lot. That it can be a scary time because not only is it kind of scary sometimes planning for the money, right? Like, am I gonna have enough? Am I on track? But then just probably, I think now we're more talking about what are you gonna do in retirement? That's also a scary question. So Charlie, I know we've looked into some research, right? There's been so many, we've gone to conferences, they talk about the art of retirement, what people do in retirement. There's been a ton of studies on this. One that we found recently, and maybe we can include this in the comments, but it was Dr. Riley Monet, who went through the 4 phases of retirement is what he calls it. And so he was just interested of like, hey, I'm retiring. What has retirement been like for other folks? And so he just interviewed hundreds of people to see what was retirement like in different ages and different phases that they were in retirement. And he was able to kind of nail down these 4 phases of retirement. And so for me, that kind of brought up the thought of like, well, if he interviewed hundreds of people and he was able to kind of say, okay, for all these folks, there's these common factors that we're able to drill this down to 4 phases. That tells me that this is you're not alone. For our listeners, if they retired and they're kind of struggling to know what to do with themselves in retirement, or someone's about to retire and they're thinking that it's very normal, right? Or else there wouldn't be a ton of research on this. He wouldn't be able to distill this down into 4 phases. And so sometimes it's just nice to know that, hey, this is normal. It almost reminds me of like, you mentioned your career and how that's something you've been doing a long time. It's like reminds me of when some folks go to college, right? They don't know what they want to do yet. Like they kind of say they're exploratory and they explore their options and they finally drill it down. And I think retirement can be similar because he had a statistic that most people will spend 1/3 of their life in retirement. Yeah, that's a lot of time. It's enough time for this whole other phase of your life, right? That you're going to be doing something completely different. And you want to, of course, everyone wants to enjoy it, right? He called it, how do you squeeze the juice out of retirement, if you will? And so this was his framework. We'll go through it really quickly. It also made me think of, it's important to prepare for these things, even if you can't simulate it, right? I mean, I guess the hybrid retirement, that's kind of the best way we found maybe for folks to dip their toes in. You're not fully in, but you're simulating it a little bit. But I think preparing some is better than not preparing at all, right? And just at least thinking about it. So the 4 phases are, he mentioned vacation, and I'll expand on these more, but I'm just going to shout them out first. So vacation, loss, experiment, or trial and error, and then reinvest. With vacation, as we can probably imagine, or we've seen for our folks, they retire and it's like vacation, right? The kind of honeymoon phase of retirement. He said you're relaxing, you have freedom, you're not having to go fly, not having to make the commute. You wake up whenever you want, you can do whatever you want. And he said that this lasts about a year until it kind of starts to lose its luster a little bit, right? It's like, well, I'm bored now, right? And Charlie, I know you found a good resource too on boredom. Oh, gosh. And maybe
let's say that, Nolan, because it's so funny. The article that you and I both read from Dr. Arthur Brooks, but it's one of the adjustments, and I just wrote a newsletter about it too. Like, we don't allow ourselves to be bored very often. To your point on the first phase, vacation is that first phase that Dr. Riley, whose last name is hard to pronounce, sorry for butchering that, Dr. Riley, Moynes, Moynes. You did the French pronunciation, Monet, right, or something. But anyway, it was a TED Talk, 4 phases. But that first vacation phase, you can only do so much pickleball and golf and until maybe you're on the beach. And I know right now, Nolan, I get on the beach for a day or so and I'm done. I'm ready to go and do something else. But Dr. Brooks is he's a behavioral scientist, that had an article. We'll have the show notes on here. And he talked about the healthiness of being bored and how it's really difficult to face. And this is one of those things, preparing emotionally for retirement, that we talked about, Nolan, where you better get used to a little bit of that. We don't want you to be totally bored in retirement all the time, but it's actually healthy. It's actually good for you, but it's really hard. And Dr. Brooks talks about, how healthy it can be for you mentally and emotionally preparing, but it's also difficult. In fact, one part of the article, known as hilarious, he said he referenced another Harvard researcher named Dan Gilbert. I think he had he did an experiment where he had people sitting in this room with nothing else to do. You sat in this room with nothing except one button. And he wanted to see how long people could be bored before they hit that button, Nolan. And the funny thing about that button is that when they hit the button, it gave them a shock. So it shocked them. And so the choice was simple: sit in this room by yourself being bored, or shock yourself. And so not most, I shouldn't say that, but many people chose to get shocked versus sit there in boredom. That's how difficult this can be. And so we'll have, a link to that article. But I thought that was fascinating, Nolan, like this difficulty of transitioning from being busy all the time. Our phones are there, the news is there. There's never a down, quiet moment, man. And it's a big transition.
Yeah, especially when a lot of this does boil down to identity, right? You mentioned it earlier, and I think that was his point about boredom, is that if we're really trying to find our identity in retirement, then we got to think about it, right? And that obviously, from your shocking example, and us as humans just wanting to rather get shocked in 15 seconds than think about these things, obviously it's hard, right? Or else that wouldn't happen. I know I can speak to that too. Charlie mentioned phones, all these distractions. He even mentioned, hey, go to the gym and don't wear earbuds, right? Or don't listen to a podcast, don't listen to music. Just go do that. And I did try that, and I went to the gym, and I was like, well, they're playing music at the gym. And so it's like, we live in a world where, man, it's hard to get.
It is.
But we'll move on to number 2 here. So, again, recap: vacation, that first phase, if you will, kind of a vacation, honeymoon phase. Once that starts to lose its luster, partly probably because Dr. Riley found that we miss routine in some ways, right? I mean, our lives, especially in the working years, we have a routine, and maybe we're in retirement, finding that new routine can be hard. So it goes from honeymoon to we're starting to feel a sense of loss, right? He says it almost like you get hit by a bus, because it's a realization that he mentioned 5 things. You lose your routine, your identity, relationships from work, your purpose, and then a loss of power for some people. So that's a lot. And I know this is kind of depressing so far, but don't worry, there's the 4th one that gives hope. I was kind of thinking that when I was looking at the research. I was like, man, this is a little depressing, but it is good to think about, because we'll all have to come face to face with it someday. So that's really stage 2, is just you're just in it, right? You're just in that phase of kind of feeling loss. He called it lost and lost. Right. So you've experienced loss of not being in the workforce, but then you're also lost of just, where do I go now? And that's number 3, trial and error. He called it experimental phase, but he just said, just try things you enjoy and love to do. I know the school I went to growing up, they send out newsletters, and they sent one recently, Charlie, which is kind of just in time for this podcast. But it was about a couple who they've retired, their kids are all grown now. And now they go all over the country and play pickleball. They love it. That's something they do together. It's like it kind of sounds like they may be in the honeymoon phase still, because they were saying, I think they just retired and they were loving it. But that's awesome. They're trying stuff out, and they're just seeing what sticks, I guess, and what they're enjoying. Have you seen? I know we have probably all kinds of client examples on this, because we have just amazing clients with interesting stories and things they're interested in. But have you seen any examples firsthand of our clients in retirement?
It's kind of like a blessing and a curse at times, because as an airline or a corporate fractional pilot, you have you have a lot of time off, sometimes, but you're also gone. It seems the life to me was very disjointed. And so you do have some time to develop hobbies or whatever, things that you might carry into retirement. But the tough thing, I think, Nolan, for our audience was the relationship piece. I'm not sure exactly where that fits in on the, steps 1, 2, 3, 4, experiment, whatever. But Dr. Finko, who's another podcast we did, check that out. I thought was one of our best because of him. But it was his research showed that whatever you do in retirement, whatever money, however you spend your money, it ultimately is in the purpose of building relationships. He had one example where somebody joined a car club. They loved cars. They spent their money on cars, a car club, old cars, whatever. But it was really about the socialization part of it. That's where the real reward was in retirement. And I think can be difficult for airline pilots to transition to this world where it's hard to maintain relationships because your life is disjointed. So I think if you're going to retire early, that's something to really focus on, is building relationships outside of your marriage, because your husband or your wife is going to be tired of you around the house all the time. Trust me on that one. And so you're going to have to adjust with that as well. So it's real. And they've already, your spouse, they've already established their relationships. They've been home all along. And now you come back into the picture and it's a little disruptive. So yeah, it's a thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, number two, where we were talking about loss, that's what it's kind of, loss of relationship, right? Because maybe if you weren't even that close to people you were flying with, it's like, well, you're still getting some sort of like relationship, right? Or you're at least having exposure to talking with people and being around people, but then you're retired. And like you said, it takes effort and it takes work. And so right now we've gone from vacation phase, you're feeling a sense of loss after that honeymoon phase is ended kind of, and then you go to trial and error. And then the fourth stage and the last one is what is the good part, right? I said it's been depressing so far. Number 4 is, he calls it reinvest, which I think goes into your relationship example. He calls it the most gratifying and satisfying out of all of it. And he said not everyone reaches this, he found in his research, but he said the people that do are some of the most happy people he's ever met. And he said that the common denominator that he found was that, he said, it's important to find activities and relationships that give life meaning and purpose. And almost always it involves service to others. Yeah. And that, of course, looks very different for many folks. Could be helping out with charities, volunteering, whatever it may be, helping out with your grandkids, who knows. But that's just what he found, is that service to others and just being with others is what he's found in his most happy retirees. And that this is where those 5 things of you get your routine back, your identity starts to come back, you get relationships back, you find your purpose, and then the loss of power that you felt at first just seems a little more diminished. So it's almost like all those things kind of come back and are recovered. But what are your thoughts on that framework, Charlie?
Yeah, I would encourage everyone to go look at that. It's a TED Talk. Like we said, we'll put a link into it. I thought it was excellent. And I know we've kind of joked a little bit about, hey, it's kind of depressing, but I want to focus on that for a minute, because it can be really challenging. And not everybody, in his video, he says, makes it to step number 4. Yeah. There's depression, there's divorce. If you're not prepared for this transition and at least aware of it, thinking about it, being intentional about it, then it may not turn out that well. And I hate to be a Debbie Downer, so to speak, on that, but we hope everybody gets to phase 4, but it takes intentionality. It takes, working and experimenting, all the things that you just said. But it's fascinating, Nolan, in all of our reading and research or these podcasts, we always find that common theme of generosity, service to others, whether that be generosity to your adult children at this point, whether that be service to your wife or your friends or your whomever. That seems to be a really common theme throughout all of our studies that really provides that fulfillment in retirement and even non-retirement, quite frankly. So I think that's amazing to me, Nolan.
For sure. And, just for our audience, the reason, Charlie, I think we're talking about this to begin with, because it's not numbers, right? It's not numbers oriented. This is all the emotional side of it. And this is really the hard work that we can't do for our clients, right? But we can at least What we've seen, though, is that our hope is to make our client financial picture, to help them have more confidence and clarity with that so that they can have time to do the things that they enjoy. And we've seen that there's clients that they have it, they're set financially, but retirement is hard. And so we've seen that, and we just want to kind of get others prepared for that because I think everyone will face that challenge for sure.
Yeah, it's a real thing. And I'm just now, I'm getting ready to turn 52 this summer, Nolan, and I'm starting to think about these things. Kevin Gormley, who, is part of Leading Edge as well, of course, my co-founder, I'm going to out him. He turned 60 in January, and it changes things. You start to think differently. Like, man, what would it be like to retire or, do nothing? Am I ready for that? And so I think it can be an awesome thing, but I think it takes a little bit of intentionality, a lot of planning. And just like we talked about the budgeting, Nolan, practicing that budgeting, we've seen people practice. That was one of the blessings or silver linings, if you will, of 2020, where people got a lot of time off in the airlines, is they got 6 months to a year in some cases to practice being retired. And some of them really enjoyed it, and some of them may not have, and so I would encourage anyone at some point that's considering early retirement or even normal retirement, practice it. Get a few months where you pretend to be retired, get used to being a little bit bored. It's okay, having some downtime, prepare for that mentally, for that extra space in your schedule. And I think it'll allow you to have a lot more fulfilling retirement sooner. So that's our hope anyway, Nolan.
That's right. Yeah. Easier said than done. That's our hope.
Awesome. Well, Nolan, thanks so much for the time today. What an amazing topic. Any one of these little things we could turn into a podcast. Generosity, charitable giving, service to others. All of these things are really powerful. So thanks for hanging in there with us today. We encourage all of our listeners, share this with someone you think that could benefit. Subscribe to the podcast, comment on YouTube. We're there. Subscribe to that channel as well. We're all over social. So please share. It helps us to reach others. Rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to your podcast as well. So we love our audience. We appreciate our professional aviators, airline, fractional, corporate, military, and even spouses along for the ride as well. So thanks again, Nolan, for being with us today. We wish everyone all the best.
Thanks, Charlie.
See you. Hello, Pilot Podcast family. Charlie here. I just wanted to share with you something we've just recently developed. In the show notes, you're going to see the Pilot Wealth Index. We want you to check it out, give it a shot. It's a quiz, a short questionnaire that allows you to understand, are you on track? We have a lot of people that say, hey, we just want to know if we're on track. Are we where we should be at this stage of our flying career, airline career, whatever it might be? How am I doing? Am I close to my peer group? Am I behind? Am I ahead? We've developed some questions, some metrics that we think if you go through this and check it out, answer the questions, you will have a very good idea of where you stand. We developed the questions that give an indication of, are you doing the right things you need to do to be prepared for an eventual retirement, and that one that can be profitable for you. So check it out in the show notes, the Leading Edge Pilot Wealth Index. We hope you give it a shot. If you have any questions at all, reach out. Happy to help. Charlie at leadingedgeplanning.com. Again, that's Charlie at leadingedgeplanning.com. You can call or text me on my cell, 865-328-4969. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Pilot Money Guys podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes or wherever you listen. We are grateful for your reviews because they encourage others to listen in. Visit leadingedgeplanning.com to learn more and subscribe to our newsletter. Leading Edge Financial Planning, LLC, LEFP, is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where LEFP and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.leadingedgeplanning.com. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. These documents may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. All information has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, but its accuracy is not guaranteed. There is no representation or warranty as to the current accuracy, reliability, or completeness of, nor liability for, decisions based on such information, and it should not be relied on as such.